I'm Rose Berger. I'm the associate editor of Sojourners magazine. We're here today with Jim Douglas, who is the author of JFK and the Unspeakable, Why He Died and Why It Matters. Jim Douglas is a longtime Catholic peace activist and theologian, and was a founder of the Ground Zero community in Washington. And he and his wife Shelley are also the founders of Mary's House, a Catholic worker house of hospitality in Birmingham, Alabama, where Jim currently lives. So we're grateful to have Jim here with us today. And we're going to talk to him a little bit about his book and the work that he's doing now around the topic of JFK and a number of the assassinations that happened in the United States in the 60s. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Rose.
Tell me first how this book came to be. I know you started out first with some interest in King's assassination, and that led in some ways into JFK and the Unspeakable. But how did this project come to be?
Martin Luther King changed my life, and it was his assassination that did that. And about 30 years later, I tried to catch up to that. Yeah. And in probing the King assassination, immediately JFK and Malcolm X and Robert Kennedy came to the surface. So it became an experiment in trying to understand all four of them in parallel. So JFK was not the beginning, and I didn't have a huge admiration for him when he was alive. And in some ways, his story of those four is the most remarkable, because he was president of the United States when he turned. It's a story in each case of a turning toward peace and justice and the consequence that that particular witness faced. And in the case of John Kennedy, he faced his assassination as a consequence of turning in a very unlikely direction, being president of the United States in the height of the Cold War.
So what were your criticisms of Kennedy at the time when he was president, and or at the time when you began writing the book, before you began to see some of the things that changed?
Well, there were criticisms that I think were legitimate, and many which remain true. And he was a cold warrior. He was a person who made serious mistakes. He did support the invasion of the Bay of Pigs, and he did almost take us into the most unimaginable kind of evil in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So there were many reasons for being reserved about John Kennedy. So, but I didn't know the further story of what came out of those experiences and how he did turn in the biblical sense. He did turn in the deepest kind of sense toward a new and much more hopeful world. And that's what I didn't have much sense of, although I had a little clue to it because I knew a man named Norman Cousins who was involved in the process of his turning. So I had a clue or two, but I didn't really know the story.
And in the book, you particularly use the hinge for Kennedy of the speech that he gave at American University on June 10th, 1963,
yes,
which happens to be my birthday, which
hey!
That date really stuck in my mind to think about all the things that happened that week,
yes,
particularly with Pope John the 23rd
that's right,
dying, and Kennedy's speech. So talk a little bit about how that speech became emblematic for you of what was going on under the surface for Kennedy.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Pope John, so that's a connection right there, because had there not been the encyclical Pacem in Terris, that speech I don't think would have been, certainly not in the same form, and perhaps not have happened. Pope John had a deep influence on Kennedy and on Khrushchev. And after the missile crisis, Khrushchev and Kennedy together, who had been terrified by the experience, and knew they had to go in a different direction and had to go together.
Terrified of the
consequences that they were
of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Of the consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and of repeating that, as would of course happen the way they were in conflict. So they had to move in a different direction, and they, in a sense, became co-conspirators, conspiracy of the spirit, and it resulted in Khrushchev at a certain point where they were trying to reach an agreement on a nuclear test ban. He said, "It's up to you. I can't move any further." And Kennedy came up with that American University address thanks to the challenge, especially of Norman Cousins and of Pope John. And Norman Cousins was an intermediary among the three of them. So Kennedy basically said, "I want to end the Cold War. Let's end the Cold War." That's the essence of the American University address. So for him to say that at that point in history was an extraordinary statement, and I think it is to his assassination as Martin Luther King's Riverside Church address is to his assassination. It's the why. It's the vision that prompted the unspeakable act.
And this is not as you said, a whodunit book about Kennedy.
No.
And part of the way that you structure the book is probing Kennedy's conversion through the lens of Thomas Merton.
That's right.
And through Merton's examination of the principalities and powers, or the sense of evil in the world that he describes in some way as the unspeakable.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit more about how Merton, as a Trappist monk who was a leading Catholic thinker at that time, how his perspective is a lens for this story.
Well, Merton, because he didn't read newspapers and watch television, but was in touch with all kinds of people through correspondence and through his prayer and through his spiritual antennae, he knew the questions to ask, and questions that I'm still pursuing, many years after his death and John Kennedy's. One question he had was Kennedy up to his task? And in '61, early in Kennedy's presidency, Merton was saying he wasn't. And in a letter to a friend, he said that Kennedy lacked the depth of humanity, as, for example, Lincoln did, to be the kind of president we needed. And he said, but if he did, by miracle, break through into that, he would be marked out for assassination. So that's the story. And Merton's questions along the way, when he anticipates the Cuban Missile Crisis, when he anticipates the U.S. move toward first strike, from his monastery, he's seeing stuff that people in Washington are either in denial of or don't see. So Merton is the Virgil, as it were, of this mountain that we have to climb to understand what's going on there.